Yeah.
So, a few years ago, during one of those idyllic summers of my past, I was sitting in a coffee shop here in Atlanta, just browsing articles on the internet, when I stumbled upon the obituary of this man, Dashrath Manjhi. He lived and died in a small village in Bihar in India. When Dashrath was a young man, he was married to a woman named Falguni Devi, whom he said to have loved very dearly. Unfortunately, sometime after their marriage, Falguni fell ill, which was no small problem as the nearest town with a doctor was more than 40 miles away on the other side of a mountain. Tragically, the distance was too great, and Falguni and Dashrath's time together too short before she passed away from the complications of her condition. Now, fearing that anyone should fare the same fate that he had suffered, Dashrath went to work. And after working constantly for 2 decades, Dashrath had single-handedly carved a 360-foot path through the mountain that had separated his beloved from medical attention, which was now less than a mile away. And of course, someone bought the movie rights. But sitting in that coffee shop, my life changed a little. What is this phenomenon we call love that can move mountains? What is it about love that could make a man devote his entire short existence to this monotonous task? Several years of searching later, I want to share with you an answer. But before we get to that, I should start here. This is a man named Sir Isaac Newton. And this is my cat, incidentally also named Sir Isaac Newton. Now it's a little funny because though I never expected feline Newton to contribute much to physics, he turned out to be a little dumb, even for a cat. But he seems pretty happy in his ignorance. You see, one day Newton, like all living things, will die. And yet he seems content to paw at string and chase lasers and nap constantly. Newton doesn't seem bothered by the prospect of death, probably because he isn't very aware of life. Perhaps luckily for him, Newton's ancestor never ate from the tree of knowledge, but mine did. Somewhere along the line, one of my ancestors found himself with enough neural volume and cortical folds to realize that he existed. And at that very moment, Adam and Eve fell from heaven. The snake of consciousness slithered its way into the garden, and humanity was infected by awareness. All of a sudden, we were different. Different from cats like Newton, different from dogs and birds and dolphins. We became sentient biology, wielding that double-edged sword we call consciousness. Adam and Eve became aware, and they became ashamed. They covered themselves. Now, it'd be silly to think that they did so out of a sense of modesty. You know, Victorians would have to wait some time still to come into existence in order to disapprove of nudity. They must have been ashamed of something much more fundamental. Sociologist Erich Fromm would say that they were ashamed because they became aware of their aloneness. They realized that they were, at least anatomically, different from one another. In their own bodies, they must be separate from the rest of existence. This is me, and the world is everything else. The knowledge of separation inspires the knowledge of finitude. I'm alone in this body, and this body is far from permanent. I end here at my fingertips, and I end at my last breath. I'm hit by the realization that I'm limited in both space and time. I'm finite. The forbidden fruit better really have been worth it. Well, let's step out of the Old Testament for a moment. In a more scientific context, we might say that the purpose of life is to persist. To persist against UV radiation and meteors and solar wind and all of the laws of entropy that say that we are a statistical improbability. Life must fight against all odds to persist. And in this paradigm, the existence of Ali Ray occurs in order to transmit the genes of his ancestors to his offspring. In the grand scheme, that is all that I am. A transient, disposable vehicle that carries genetic material for transmission until my biological machinery rusts beyond repair, and it makes economic sense for my genes to invest in a newer model. I have to admit, I feel a little guilty right now because I'm sure some of you expected this to be an uplifting talk. But the point is, we're faced with these two mammoth problems: a psychological aloneness and an awareness of our inevitable end. And forever, I thought that these problems were unsolvable. And then I started reading ghazals, which are poems of a particular Indo-Persian form. and they deal almost exclusively with this idea of separation, but in the context of something you may not expect. Love. For example, एक आग गमे तन्हाई की जो सारे बदन में फैल गई जब जिस्म ही सारा जलता हो फिर दामन दिल को बचाएं क्या. Philosophers and writers have commented extensively on love, but most of us have a sort of intuitive understanding of love. That's probably because it happens to almost everyone. Anthropological studies have found evidence of romantic love in almost every culture we've studied to date. And in those that we haven't found it, we probably just haven't looked hard enough. Everybody loves, even if we can't quite define what it is, which isn't to say that people haven't tried. Sternberg proposes a three-component theory of love. He contends that love is some combination of intimacy, commitment, and passion, and he gives names to the different combinations you can get from these components. Now, if intimacy is part and parcel of love, then we can begin to tackle the problem of aloneness. Isn't the root of our pursuit of love a desire for intimacy? That is, a desire to find someone who understands us? When we love, we share more and more of ourselves with another individual, such that the metaphysical distance between us gets smaller and smaller until we are so close that we no longer feel our psychological aloneness. We see this in popular phrases. People in love will say that they've become part of each other, they've become intertwined, they find union. Whatever the phrase that they use, the idea is the same. They found another transient, disposable vehicle, another box on a pedigree, with whom they connect on a deep level. I no longer have to be alone in my finitude. We can be finite together. I visited the shrine of my favorite poet, Mawlana Rumi, the 13th century Persian mystic who's buried in Konya in modern-day Turkey. He writes, "This is love, to fly towards a secret sky, to cause 100 veils between you to fall each moment, to let go of life." But we'll get to that. We still have a lot to learn about love, but we do know it isn't so rosy for everyone. In his hit single, the 90s singer Haddaway famously asks, "What is love?" But in the very next breath he says, "Baby, don't hurt me no more." You see, just like many other human experiences we can think of, jealousy, happiness, stress, love has both a light and a dark side. The Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, who may or may not have existed, might say it has a yin and a yang. These two forces are opposing, but never in opposition. They're intertwined, and they work together and yet antagonistically to create harmony. We can think of pathology as a disturbance of harmony, a distancing from equilibrium due to the relative overexpression of yin or yang. For our purposes, too much light in love can become garish, and too much darkness I'm sure we're all too familiar with. If you're not, I'll suggest one of two therapies. The first is to pick up Dorothy Tennant's book, Love and Limerence, and the other is to fall madly in love. The dark side of love you'll recognize as an intense pain. You see, when 100 veils between you and your beloved are falling each moment, you end up exposing your most intimate self. You become vulnerable to the beloved, because they know you, and all of your beauty and your flaws and your insecurities, and so they have a greater potential to inflict pain with smaller gestures. I can think of two defenses. The first is to forego love, which is unbearable, and the other is to build a self that strives for improvement, but is secure in their own imperfections. As rapper Kendrick Lamar says, "What's love got to do with it if you don't love yourself?" Now, I don't know if you can really love yourself, but I will contend that you should probably like yourself. But even if you do, there's no guarantee that your beloved won't make a complete mess out of you every now and then. But fortunately for us, as the yin-yang predicts, there's a note of light even in the darkness of our pained love. For me, it's precisely this note that gives our lives meaning, because if you'll remember, the second problem with consciousness was this awareness of death. No matter what, death is certain. You cannot relinquish the reaper of his profession. But we do give death something, our apprehension. We have no choice of when or to whom we are born, and most of us have no say in when or where we will die. Barring suicide, we have no idea when fate will end us. The roof of this building could collapse right now. My end may come tonight or tomorrow or in 50 years, but it's coming. So what does that have to do with love? Love can obliterate our apprehension of death. It makes our temporality bearable. to the extreme that we can accept death willingly. I'm talking about a boy from the house of Montague who takes of his own accord the kiss of death. I'm talking about Socrates, the cup of hemlock in his hands, who dies for his truth. This is the story of Jesus Christ, of Hussein ibn Ali, who can both work divine miracles but allow themselves to die at the very hands of the humanity that they save. The narrative is immortal. If Romeo and Juliet don't survive, there's Layla and Majnun, there's Shirin and Farhad. These are the narratives of those that have lived because they have found someone, something to die for. No wonder then that Sidney Carton, standing on the gallows, awaiting his execution so that his beloved can flee Paris with her husband, declares, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done before. That is to die for love. It is a far, far better rest I go to than I have ever known." It's not just that we're no longer alone, even if we are going to experience the coldest loneliness of the grave, love allows us to embrace our finitude. And I think these narratives are a very strong component of what we call spirituality. If spirituality is an explanation regarding death, then love's transcendence of death is one of the most ubiquitous narratives we can find. It may also help explain why spirituality is so common in human cultures. All people experience separation, all people love, and all people worship something. In his ghazals, the 14th century Persian poet Hafez writes about unrequited love. But over 700 years later, there's still a debate over whether he's addressing a human beloved or whether his love is addressed to God. Perhaps for Hafez, there's no difference. God is just the beloved who never responds to your flirtations. And you can only ever attain union with your divine beloved in death. But still the metaphor is love, a desire for union, a desire for the impossibility that in the act of dying, one would vanquish death. Rumi writes, "I looked upon every cross in every church, but he was not there. I went to the shrines of India and the temples of China, but he was not there. I searched the mountains of Herat and Kandahar, but he was not there. I scaled the distant peak of Mount Qaf, only to find the empty nest of the phoenix. I visited the Kaaba, but he was not in that tourist site, amidst the pilgrims young and old. And then I looked within my own heart, and there I found him. He was nowhere else." So there you have it, a psychological and philosophical reason why Dashrath Manjhi might spend his entire life cutting away at a mountain, why his energy never sapped, and why his story speaks to our souls, because we too are capable of love. I began this talk with Sir Isaac Newton, and I want to end with a quote from him I read a long time ago. "And now we might add something concerning a most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit the particles of bodies attract one another at near distances. Physical or metaphysical, this is the gravity that pulls us together, out of our isolations towards one another. Interpersonal attachment is what makes life, with all its happiness, with all its pain, worth it. It's like Rumi says, it is love that holds everything together, and it is the everything also."